Help,
Help,
I
I
can't
can't
breathe.
breathe.
The words broke apart in the air, thin and desperate, like they were slipping through fingers that could no longer hold on. Annie turned sharply. "Mister?" she said, stepping toward him, her small voice rising with sudden fear. "What's wrong? Are you okay? What's happening to you?" The man didn't answer. His hand clutched his chest, fingers digging in hard, his face flushed an alarming red, too red, like heat and pressure were building under his skin. His breathing came fast, uneven, each gasp shorter than the last. "I can't." He tried again, but the sentence never finished. Annie's heart began to pound. "Sir, talk to me," she said quickly, dropping her backpack as she moved closer. "Where does it hurt? Can you hear me?" He swayed. His knees gave out, and then he collapsed. Annie dropped to her knees beside him immediately. Sir, wake up," she said, leaning in, her hands hovering before finally gripping his sleeve. "Look at me, please." His eyes fluttered, unfocused. His chest rose sharply, then stuttered again. Annie turned toward the platform, panic rising fast. "Help! Somebody help him," she shouted. "Please, he can't breathe." A few people looked. Then just as quickly, they looked away. "Kid, don't touch him," a man near the edge said, shaking his head. "You don't know what's going on. Endofyrbpros.com. Endofrierpros. Endofrom. Endoprime. You don't know what's going on." A woman stepped back, pulling her bag closer. "Stay away. People fake stuff like this all the time," another man pointed casually. "Look at his face red like that. He's drunk. Probably just passed out." "Yeah," someone added, already walking toward where the train would arrive. "Don't get involved. Not your problem." Annie stared at them, stunned. "No, he's not pretending," she said, louder now, her voice cutting through the noise. "He's sick. Please, someone help." But no one moved. Annie looked back down at the man. His breathing was worse. Her chest tightened. Her teacher had said that once. When things got confusing, when fear tried to take over, Annie's eyes widened slightly. The phone. She scrambled quickly, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a small, worn-out flip phone. The plastic was scratched, the hinge slightly loose, her mother's old phone, given to her, just in case. Her fingers shook as she flipped it open and dialed 911. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, calm, distant. "Emergency services. What is your situation?" He fell," Annie said quickly, breathless. "A man, he can't breathe. He's on the ground at the train station. Please send help." There was a pause. Then the operator's tone shifted, slightly skeptical. "Ma'am, is this a prank call?" Annie blinked. "No, it's not a joke," she said urgently. "He's really sick. He needs help right now. Can you put an adult on the line?" the operator asked. I'm the only one here," Annie said, her voice tightening. "Everyone else just walked away." Another pause. Longer this time. "Units are currently responding to higher priority emergencies," the voice said. "Stay on the line and—" "He's getting worse," Annie interrupted, her voice rising, but the response came slower now, measured, distant. Annie looked down. The man's chest jerked again, then dipped lower. Her grip tightened. "No," she whispered. She pulled the phone away, staring at it for half a second. Then she closed it. If they weren't coming fast enough, she had to do something herself. I saw this, she muttered under her breath, trying to remember. Late nights, old videos on her mom's phone, first aid clips, people helping strangers. Okay. She placed one small hand carefully on the man's chest. "Stay with me," she said, more to herself than to him. Her movements were unsure at first, but determined. "Check breathing. Keep him awake. Don't let him slip away. Mister, listen to me," she said, leaning closer. "You're not alone. You hear me? Stay with me." His hand twitched weakly. Annie grabbed it instantly. "I'm right here." Footsteps approached quickly behind her. "Hey, what's going on here?" Annie turned sharply. A station security guard was jogging toward her, his radio bouncing at his shoulder. Relief hit her all at once. "Sir, please," Annie said, scrambling slightly toward him without letting go of the man. "He's really sick. I called 911, but they don't believe me. Can you call them? Please." The guard's expression changed immediately as he took in the scene. All right, step back just a little, kid," he said, already reaching for his radio. His voice sharpened. Dispatch. I've got a mail down. Possible cardiac, send EMS now. Priority. He knelt beside the man, checking quickly. Stay with us, sir, the guard said firmly. Annie hovered close, watching every movement. Her hands clenched together now. Is he going to be okay? She asked, her voice small but steady. We're gonna do our best, the guard replied. The overhead speaker crackled again. Attention passengers, the last train to downtown is now boarding, doors closing shortly. The train roared into the station. People moved quickly, stepping inside, not looking back. Annie turned her head slightly. That was her train, her only one. Her fingers slowly reached into her coat pocket again. She pulled out the ticket. For a moment, everything else faded. Just her, and that small piece of paper. Behind her, the warning tone began. Doors closing. Annie looked at the man. His chest rose weakly. She tightened her grip on his hand. Then she let the ticket fall. It slipped from her fingers and landed quietly on the ground. I'm staying, she said. The train doors shut. The engine roared, and the last train of the night left the station without Annie. The train was gone, but its sound lingered, fading into the tunnels like something final, something that did not come back. For a moment, the platform felt even quieter than before. Annie knelt beside the man, her small hand still wrapped tightly around his, as if letting go might make whatever thread was holding him here snap completely. The security guard had shifted into action beside her, one hand pressed near the man's neck, the other speaking rapidly into his radio, voice firm now, no hesitation left. Yeah, adult male, mid-40s, unresponsive, shallow breathing. We need EMS now, not standby now. The difference was immediate. The urgency in his tone carried weight in a way Annie's voice hadn't. The guard leaned closer to the man, adjusting his position slightly. Stay with me, sir. Don't close your eyes. Annie leaned in too, her voice softer but steady. You hear him? You're okay. We're right here. The man's chest rose again, uneven, then dipped lower. His lips had lost more color now, the red from before fading into something pale and dangerous. Is he getting worse? Annie asked. The guard didn't answer right away. He glanced at her, really looked at her this time, the small coat, the worn shoes, the fact that she hadn't moved, hadn't run, hadn't left. You did good, kid, he said quietly. You stayed. That matters. Annie nodded once, but her eyes stayed on the man. Don't let go, she whispered, mostly to herself. Annie's fingers tightened around the man's hand. She could still hear their voices in her head. He's probably drunk. Not your problem. Don't get involved. She swallowed. Her mother's voice rose up against those words, clear and steady, like it always did. We don't walk away from people who can't stand up. If this moment touched your heart and reminded you what kindness really means, take a second to like this video. Share in the comments where you are watching from and what you would have done in Annie's place. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Annie shifted slightly, adjusting her position so she could see the man's face better. His eyes fluttered again, barely open, unfocused. Mister, she said gently, can you tell me your name? No answer, just a shallow breath. Then another. The guard checked his watch. Then the tunnel. Then back to the man. EMS should be here any minute, he muttered, though there was a trace of impatience in his voice. Annie didn't know how long they had been there, seconds, minutes, but it felt like something stretched thin, something that could break if it went on too long. She looked down at their hands. His was bigger, rougher, but now completely still inside hers. You're not alone, she said again, a little louder this time. I'm still here. For a brief second, his fingers moved. That's it, she said quickly. That's good. Stay with me. The guard noticed too. Yeah, that's it. Stay awake, sir. Don't check out on us. From somewhere above, faint sirens began to echo through the night. Distant, then closer. Annie's shoulders lifted just slightly, a breath she hadn't realized she was holding finally releasing. They're coming, she said. The guard nodded. Yeah, they're coming. The man's chest rose again, but weaker now. His breathing was uneven, like it was losing its rhythm, slipping out of sync with itself. Annie leaned closer. Mister, listen to me, she said, her voice low and focused. You have to keep breathing. Just like this. In and out. You can do it. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she kept talking anyway. The sirens grew louder. bouncing off the concrete walls, filling the station with something sharp and urgent. Red and blue lights flickered faintly at the top of the stairs. The guard stood partially, waving toward the entrance. "Down here," he shouted. Footsteps fast. Heavy rushed down toward them. 2 paramedics appeared moments later, moving with practiced speed, bags already in hand. "What do we got?" one of them asked, dropping to his knees beside the man. "Collapsed about 5 minutes ago," the guard said. "Chest pain, breathing shallow, in and out." The paramedic nodded, already checking vitals, attaching monitors, calling out numbers to his partner. "Sir, can you hear me?" The second paramedic asked, leaning close. No response. Annie shifted back slightly, making room but not leaving. She watched everything, every movement, every word. "Pulse is weak," one of them said. "Let's move. We're losing time." They worked quickly, efficiently, lifting the man onto a stretcher, securing straps, adjusting equipment. Annie stood slowly, her legs stiff, her hands still tingling from where she had held his. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked. One of the paramedics glanced at her briefly, not dismissive, but focused, already halfway into the next step. "We're going to do everything we can," he said. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't nothing. They began moving toward the stairs. The guard turned to Annie. "You got someone to call, kid? Family?" Annie hesitated. "My mom. She's working," she said. "You want to go home?" Annie looked toward the stairs, then back at the stretcher. The man's arm had shifted slightly, hanging near the edge. For a second, she remembered the weight of his hand in hers, the way it had almost slipped away. Can I come?" she asked quietly. The guard blinked. "Come where?" "With him," Annie said. "To the hospital." There was a pause. The paramedics were already moving, already climbing. The guard looked at her again, really looked. "You know him?" he asked. Annie shook her head. "No, sir." "Then why?" She didn't let him finish. "Because he was alone," she said simply. The guard held her gaze for a second longer. Then he sighed. Not annoyed, not dismissive, just something softer. "Stay close," he said. "Don't get in the way." Annie nodded immediately. She followed, up the stairs, out into the cold night, into flashing lights and open ambulance doors. She climbed in without hesitation, small and quiet, settling near the edge as the paramedics continued working. The doors slammed shut. The siren rose again, and as the ambulance pulled away from the station, Annie Johnson sat beside a stranger she had chosen not to leave behind, carrying nothing with her now except a memory of a train she had let go, and a decision she could not take back. The ambulance moved fast, but inside, time felt strange, compressed and stretched at the same time, like every second mattered too much. Annie sat on the narrow bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the man lying just a few feet away. The paramedics worked around him with quiet precision, their movements practiced, efficient, almost mechanical but not cold, focused. "Urgent. BP dropping," one of them said, glancing at the monitor. "Let's keep oxygen on him. Stay with me, sir." "You hear me?" the other added, adjusting the mask over the man's face. The man didn't respond. His chest rose under the straps, uneven, shallow, like each breath had to be pulled out of him. Annie leaned forward slightly, her small frame tense. "Mister," she said softly, careful not to get in the way. "You're in an ambulance now. They're helping you." One of the paramedics glanced at her briefly, surprised she was still speaking, still engaged, but he didn't stop her. Sometimes voices helped, sometimes they didn't, but silence never did. The city lights flashed through the back windows in streaks of yellow and white. The siren wailed above them, loud and constant, cutting through the night, clearing a path that Annie had never seen up close before. She had ridden buses, walked blocks, waited in lines, but this was different. This was urgency. This was what happened when someone mattered enough to move the world out of the way. Her eyes dropped to the man's hand. It lay still beside him. For a moment, she hesitated. Then slowly, carefully, she reached out and touched it again, just her fingers at first. Then her whole hand, cold, still cold, but not gone. "I'm still here," she whispered. The paramedic nearest her noticed. He didn't stop her. Instead, he said quietly, "That's good. Keep talking to him." Annie nodded once. She leaned a little closer. "You're going to be okay," she said, repeating the words she had heard adults say, hoping they were true. "You just have to stay." The man's eyelids flickered slightly. It was small, barely noticeable. But Annie saw it. He moved, she said quickly. Yeah, the paramedic replied without looking up. That's good. Keep him with us. Annie tightened her grip just a little. You hear that? She said softly. You're doing good. The ambulance turned sharply, and Annie braced herself against the seat, her shoulder pressing lightly against the wall. Outside, the city blurred past dark buildings, empty streets, the occasional glow of a late-night diner or gas station. For a brief second, her mind drifted. The train, the platform, the ticket. She imagined it still lying there on the ground, small and forgotten, like it had never mattered. Her chest tightened slightly. That had been her chance. Her one chance. She knew that. Even at 6, she understood what last train really meant. It didn't just mean transportation. It meant timing, opportunity, a door that closed and did not reopen. She pressed her lips together, steadying herself. Then she looked back at the man. His breathing hitched again, uneven, fading, and just like that, the thought disappeared. This mattered more. Right now, this. The paramedics moved faster. Stay with me, one of them said firmly, checking the monitor again. Don't lose him. Lose him. The words landed heavier than anything else. Annie shook her head slightly. No, she whispered. You're not going anywhere. She didn't know him, didn't know his name, didn't know where he came from, but she knew one thing clearly. He had asked for help, and no one else had answered. So she had. The ambulance slowed, then stopped. All right, we're here, one paramedic said, already moving. The doors flew open. Cold air rushed in. Bright lights flooded the space. Cook County ER, someone called out. Everything moved quickly after that. The stretcher rolled out, wheels clattering against metal, voices overlapping. Male, mid-40s, possible cardiaque. BP unstable. Let's move, let's move. Annie jumped down carefully, staying close but out of the way, her eyes wide as the scene unfolded around her. Nurses met them at the entrance, taking over seamlessly, guiding the stretcher through sliding doors that opened with a sharp mechanical sound. Inside, everything was brighter, louder, faster. People moved with purpose, conversations clipped and efficient, the air filled with urgency, and something sterile that Annie couldn't quite name. She stopped just inside the entrance, unsure now. The man was being taken further in, away from her. Wait, she said instinctively, taking a step forward, but a nurse gently placed a hand out, stopping her. You can't go past this point, sweetheart, she said, not unkindly. Annie hesitated. Her hand felt suddenly empty, like something important had just been taken from it. I came with him, she said quietly. The nurse looked at her, then at the empty space behind her. Are you family? She asked. Annie shook her head. No, ma'am. The nurse's expression softened, but only slightly. Then you need to wait out here, okay? We'll take care of him. Take care of him. Annie nodded slowly. She stepped back. The doors closed, and just like that, he was gone from sight. The noise of the hospital continued around her. But it felt distant now, like she was standing behind glass, watching something she wasn't part of anymore. She looked down at her hands. They were still shaking slightly. She hadn't noticed before. Now she did. A chair sat against the wall nearby. Plastic, cold-looking. She walked over and sat down slowly, her feet not quite touching the floor. For the first time since the station, she was still. No sirengs, no shouting, no rushing, just waiting. She stared at the floor for a long moment, then up at the doors, then back at her hands. He's going to be okay, she whispered to herself, not because she knew, but because she needed to believe it. A few minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time felt different here. A doctor walked by. A nurse spoke quietly into a phone. Somewhere, a monitor beeped steadily. Life and uncertainty moved side by side in this place. Annie leaned back slightly in the chair, her small body finally beginning to feel the weight of everything that had just happened. She hadn't cried. She wasn't crying now, but something inside her had shifted. Something quieter, heavier. She looked toward the doors again. You're not alone, she said softly, repeating the promise she had made. And even though he couldn't hear her anymore, she stayed. The waiting room did not quiet down. It only changed its kind of noise. The urgency of sirens and shouted instructions faded into something lower, steadier phones ringing softly, shoes moving across polished floors, distant voices speaking in calm, controlled tones. It was the kind of place where everything important happened behind closed doors, and everyone else was left outside with their thoughts. Annie sat still in the plastic chair, her hands resting in her lap, her back straight the way her mother had taught her. She watched the double doors where the man had disappeared, her eyes fixed on that narrow space as if looking hard enough might bring him back. No one had come to ask about her. No one had asked her name. She wasn't surprised. Hospitals, like train stations, seemed to know who belonged and who didn't. A nurse walked past her quickly, holding a clipboard, her shoes making soft tapping sounds against the floor. Annie followed her with her eyes for a moment, then looked back at the doors. Time moved. Slowly, the clock on the wall ticked forward, each second loud in its own quiet way. Annie shifted slightly in her seat, her legs swinging just a little above the ground. Her body was beginning to feel tired now, the kind of tired that came after something big, something that didn't give you time to think until it was over. Her fingers curled together, then uncurled. She looked down at them again. They didn't feel the same. They felt older, like they had done something they weren't used to doing. She rubbed her palms together softly. "You did what you were supposed to," she whispered, repeating the words her mother often said after a long day. "You did the right thing." The sentence didn't make everything better, but it gave her something to hold on to. A few seats away, an older man sat hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. He looked like he had been there a long time. His eyes were fixed on the floor, unmoving. Across the room, a woman spoke quietly into her phone, her voice strained but controlled. Annie couldn't hear the words, only the tone. Everyone here was waiting for something. Good news, bad news. Annie news. Annie understood that without needing it, explained. The doors remained closed. She leaned back slightly, her head resting against the cool plastic of the chair. For a moment, her eyes drifted shut, not fully asleep, just a brief pause, like her body was catching up to everything her mind had pushed through. Then the doors opened. Annie's eyes snapped back. A nurse stepped out, followed by a doctor in a white coat. They spoke briefly, quietly, then separated, moving in different directions. Annie sat up straighter. She didn't know what she was waiting for exactly. A name, a sign, something, but nothing came. The doors closed again. She exhaled slowly. Her stomach felt tight now. She hadn't eaten since earlier that evening, but hunger didn't feel important, not compared to this. A few minutes later, the security guard from the station appeared at the entrance, scanning the room until his eyes landed on her. "There you are," he said, walking over. His tone was softer now, less urgent than before. Annie looked up at him. "Is he okay?" she asked immediately. The guard hesitated just slightly. "They're working on him," he said. "Doctors are with him." It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't the worst answer either. Annie nodded. The guard glanced at the empty seat beside her, then back at her face. "You got someone coming for you? Your mom?" Annie shook her head. "She's at work." He frowned slightly. "She know you're here?" Annie hesitated. "No, sir." The guard exhaled through his nose, thinking. "All right," he said. "We'll figure that out in a minute." He sat down in the chair next to her, leaning forward slightly, elbows on his knees. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You stayed with him the whole time?" Annie nodded. "Yes, sir. That's not easy," he said. "A lot of adults wouldn't have done that." Annie looked down at her hands again. "They said he was pretending," she said quietly, "that he was drunk." The guard's jaw tightened slightly. "Yeah," he said. "People say a lot of things when they don't want to get involved." Annie didn't respond. She already understood that. The guard glanced at her again. "You did the right thing." Annie nodded once. "I know." There was no pride in her voice, just certainty. The doors opened again. This time, a doctor stepped out alone. He scanned the room briefly, then looked down at a clipboard, then back up again. "Is there anyone here for the unidentified male brought in about 20 minutes ago?" he called. Annie stood up immediately. "I came with him," she said. The doctor looked at her, surprised. "You did?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." He stepped closer, his expression shifting slightly as he took in her size, her age, the seriousness in her eyes. "Are you related to him?" he asked. "No, sir." The doctor paused. Then he crouched down so he was closer to her level. "That was a very brave thing you did," he said. Annie didn't smile. She just asked, "Is he going to be okay?" The doctor studied her for a moment before answering. "He had a severe cardiac event," he said carefully. "We were able to stabilize him, but he's not out of danger yet." Annie absorbed that slowly. Not out of danger, but alive. That was enough for now. She nodded. "Can I see him?" she asked. The doctor hesitated, then shook his head gently. Not right now. He needs rest, and we need to monitor him closely. Annie looked toward the doors again, then back at the doctor. Will he be alone? She asked. The question caught him slightly off guard. He blinked once. Not exactly, he said. There will be nurses, staff. Annie shook her head slightly. That's not the same. The doctor didn't answer right away, because he knew she was right. The guard shifted beside her, watching the exchange quietly. Annie's voice softened just a little. I told him I wouldn't leave, she said. The doctor's expression changed again. Not professional this time. Human. He glanced at the doors, then back at her. I'll see what I can do, he said finally. Annie nodded. Thank you. The doctor stood, giving a small nod to the guard before heading back through the doors. They closed behind him. Annie sat back down slowly. Her hands returned to her lap. Her eyes returned to the doors. She didn't know how long she would have to wait. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing clearly. She had stayed this far, and she wasn't leaving now. The doors stayed closed longer this time. Annie noticed that, not because she was counting seconds, but because she had begun to measure time differently now by how long nothing changed. The waiting room had shifted again. A few new faces had come in. Others had left. The man sitting across from her was gone, replaced by a woman holding a paper cup with both hands like it was something steady in an unsteady place. The security guard remained beside Annie, though he had leaned back in his chair now, one arm resting across his chest. He wasn't watching her directly anymore, but he hadn't left. That mattered too. Annie kept her eyes on the doors. Every time they opened, her body straightened slightly, her hands tightening just a little. Every time they closed without anyone calling for her, something inside her settled again, but not fully, not comfortably, just enough to keep waiting. After a while, the doctor returned. This time, he walked directly toward her. Annie stood before he reached her. Can I see him now? She asked. The doctor paused in front of her, his expression thoughtful, as if he had already decided something but was still weighing how to say it. For a few minutes, he said finally. You have to stay quiet, and you can't touch anything unless I tell you. Do you understand? Annie nodded immediately. Yes, sir. The security guard shifted forward. You want me to come along? He asked. The doctor shook his head gently. She'll be fine. Annie glanced at the guard briefly, then back at the doctor. I'll be right here when you come back, the guard said. Annie gave a small nod. Then she followed. The doors opened, and this time, she stepped through them. Inside, everything felt different. Brighter, sharper. The air carried that same sterile scent, but stronger now, mixed with something metallic, something clean and cold. Machines beeped steadily in the background, not loud, but constant, like a quiet reminder that life was being measured here, second by second. They walked down a hallway lined with rooms, some with curtains drawn, others partially open. Annie kept close to the doctor, her steps small but quick, her eyes taking in everything without really focusing on anything. Until they stopped. This one, the doctor said, pulling the curtain slightly aside. Annie stepped in. The man lay on the bed, almost unrecognizable from the one she had seen on the platform. He looked smaller now. Still, a thin oxygen tube ran beneath his nose. Wires connected his chest to a monitor that blinked with soft green lines. His skin had lost that alarming red, but it hadn't returned to normal either. It was pale, worn, like something had taken more from him than it should have. Annie took a slow step closer. He's stable for now, the doctor said quietly behind her. But his heart is weak. We're watching him closely. Annie nodded, though her eyes never left the man. She moved to the side of the bed. For a moment, she didn't speak. She just looked. This was the same man, the one who had been gasping for air, the one everyone had walked past, the one she had chosen to stay with. He looked different here. Not important. Not powerful. Just human. Fragile. Annie reached out slightly, then paused, remembering the doctor's instructions. Can I hold his hand? She asked softly. The doctor hesitated only for a second. Gently, he said. Annie nodded. She placed her small hand over his. It was warmer now. Not by much, but enough. I'm here, she said quietly. The words came naturally, like they belonged in this moment. The monitor beeped steadily beside them. The man didn't move, but Annie stayed. You scared me, she added, her voice still soft, still calm. You shouldn't do that. The doctor watched her from a short distance, his expression unreadable at first. Then something in it shifted. Respect. Not for her size, not for her age, but for the way she stood there, steady, grounded, present in a way many adults weren't. Annie adjusted her hand slightly, making sure she wasn't pressing too hard. You're in a hospital now, she continued. They're helping you. You just have to rest. The man's fingers twitched faintly. It was small, barely there, but Annie felt it. Her eyes lifted immediately. He moved, she said. The doctor stepped closer, glancing at the monitor, then at the man. It's a good sign, he said. Very small, but good. Annie nodded, her grip steady. You see? She whispered to the man. You're doing better. The room settled into a quiet rhythm. Beep. Pause. Beep. Annie stayed like that for a while, not speaking much, just being there. After a few minutes, the doctor cleared his throat gently. That's enough for now, he said. He needs to rest. Annie looked up, then back at the man. She slowly lifted her hand away. For a brief second, it lingered above his. Then she pulled it back. Okay, she said. She stepped back from the bed, but her eyes stayed on him. I'll come back, she said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a promise. The doctor gave a small nod, then gestured toward the hallway. Annie followed him out. The curtain closed behind them. The hallway felt louder now after the quiet of the room. The waiting room even more so. The security guard looked up as she returned. Well? He asked. Annie walked back to her chair and sat down. He's still here, she said. The guard studied her face for a moment, then nodded. That's something, he said. Annie leaned back slightly, her hands returning to her lap. But this time, they felt different. Warmer. Steadier. She had seen him. She knew he was still fighting. And somehow, that made the waiting easier. Not easy, but easier. She looked toward the doors again. And this time, she wasn't just hoping. She was certain. He wasn't alone anymore. And neither was she. The waiting became heavier after Annie returned from the room. Before, it had been filled with uncertainty. Now, it was filled with something else, knowledge. She had seen him. She had seen how close he was to slipping away, how quiet his body had become under the machines that were keeping track of every fragile breath. It made everything feel more real. The security guard stood up after a while, stretching his back slightly. I'm going to check in with the front desk, he said. Make sure they've got someone reaching your mom. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. You stay right here. I will. He gave her one last look, then walked off, his steps steady but unhurried. Annie was alone again. Not completely alone, there were still people in the waiting room, but alone in the way that mattered. Alone with her thoughts. Alone with the quiet weight of what she had done and what might still happen. She leaned back in the chair, her head resting against the wall behind her. The ceiling lights were too bright to look at directly, so she let her eyes drift downward, focusing on the scuffed floor tiles instead. Her stomach tightened slightly. This time she noticed it. Hunger. It had been a long time since she had eaten anything. She tried to remember what she had something small, something quick before leaving home. It didn't matter. She pressed her hands lightly against her stomach, then let them fall back into her lap. It wasn't important. Not right now. Across the room, the woman with the paper cup stood up and walked toward the vending machines. The hum of the machine grew louder as she pressed buttons, coins dropping with soft metallic clinks. A moment later, the sound of a snack falling into the tray echoed faintly. Annie watched without really meaning to. The woman glanced over, hesitated, then walked toward her. You here by yourself? She asked gently. Annie nodded. Yes, ma'am. The woman studied her for a moment, then held out the snack, a small packet of crackers. You should eat something. Annie hesitated. Her mother's voice rose in her mind again, quiet but firm. Say thank you, always. She reached out carefully and took it. Thank you, ma'am. The woman gave a small nod and returned to her seat without another word. Annie looked down at the crackers in her hand. For a moment, she just held them. Then she opened the packet slowly. The sound seemed louder than it should have. She ate one, then another. Small bites. Careful, not rushed. The simple act of eating grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. It reminded her that the world hadn't stopped completely, that things still moved forward, even in places like this. She finished the packet and folded the empty wrapper neatly in her hands. Then she looked back at the doors. They said, "You're stable," she whispered softly, as if the man could somehow hear her through the walls. That means you're staying. She paused. That's good. Footsteps approached again. The security guard returned, slower this time. I talked to the front desk. he said, sitting back down beside her. They're trying to reach your mom. Annie nodded. Okay. He glanced at her hands. You eat something? Yes, sir. Good. They sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, You know, most people would have gotten on that train. Annie didn't look at him. I know. You didn't. She shook her head slightly. No, sir. He studied her for a second. Why? Annie thought about that. Not for long. Just enough. Because he asked for help, she said simply. The guard leaned back, exhaling slowly. Yeah, he said. He did. There was no argument in his voice. No correction. Just agreement. The doors opened again. This time, a nurse stepped out, scanning the room briefly before walking toward the front desk. Annie followed her with her eyes, then looked back at the doors. Her fingers moved slightly in her lap, remembering the feeling of the man's hand in hers. Cold, then warmer, then moving. Just a little. She held on to that. That small movement. That small sign. It meant something. It had to. Do you think he remembers? She asked suddenly. The guard glanced at her. Remembers what? That I stayed, Annie said. The guard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think people remember things like that, even if they don't know how to say it. Annie nodded slowly. That was enough for her. A few minutes later, the doctor returned again. This time his pace was less hurried, more measured. Annie stood immediately. The guard did too. How is he? Annie asked. The doctor looked at her, then at the guard, then back at her. He's holding steady, he said. That's good. Very good, considering how he came in. Annie let out a small breath. Not relief. Not completely. But something close. He's not awake yet. The doctor continued. But his body is responding. That means he's fighting. Annie nodded. I know, she said quietly. The doctor studied her again, as if trying to understand how someone so young could sound so certain. Then he said, We'll be moving him to a monitored room soon. He'll need time. Annie looked toward the doors. Can I stay? She asked. The doctor hesitated. Then he asked, For how long? Annie didn't answer right away. She didn't know the exact time. She only knew the feeling. Until he's not alone anymore, she said. The room went quiet for a second. The guard looked at her, then at the doctor. The doctor exhaled softly. We'll see what we can do, he said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. Annie nodded. That was enough. She sat back down, her hands folded again, her eyes steady. The night stretched on, but she didn't drift. She didn't fade. She stayed exactly where she had chosen to be, waiting, watching, holding on to something invisible, but unbreakable. And somewhere beyond those doors, the man she had refused to leave behind was still breathing, because she hadn't walked away. Morning arrived without asking anyone in the waiting room if they were ready for it. The light came first thin, pale streaks slipping through the high windows near the ceiling, softening the harshness of the fluorescent glow. Then came the change in sound. The quiet of midnight shifted into the steady rhythm of a hospital waking up. More footsteps. More voices. More movement. Nurses changing shifts. Phones ringing more often. Life continuing, whether anyone in that room was prepared for it or not. Annie noticed it all without moving much. She had not slept. Not really. Her body had rested in small moments, eyes closing for a minute, head leaning back, but her mind had stayed alert, anchored to one thing: the man behind those doors. The security guard had been replaced sometime during the early hours. A new one stood near the entrance now, younger, quieter, watching the room with professional distance. The first guard had left with a nod in Annie's direction and a quiet, "You did good, kid," before disappearing into the shift change. Annie had nodded back. She hadn't said much. There wasn't much to say. The woman who had given her the crackers was gone too. The chair across from Annie sat empty now. The paper cup left behind in the trash bin nearby. Everything changed, but Annie stayed. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers loosely intertwined. Her coat was still buttoned wrong, one side slightly higher than the other, but she hadn't noticed. Her shoes were still dusty from the station. Her hair had fallen slightly out of place. None of it mattered. Her eyes remained fixed on the double doors. A nurse passed by and glanced at her briefly, then did a double take. Annie noticed that too. People were beginning to notice her now. A small girl, alone, still there. Hours later, a quiet kind of attention. Not loud, not intrusive, but present. At the front desk, two nurses spoke in low voices, their eyes flicking toward Annie more than once. "She's been here all night?" one asked. "That's what I heard," the other replied. Came in with that cardiac patient. Family? No. The first nurse looked over again, her expression shifting slightly. Then why is she still here? The second nurse didn't answer right away, because the answer didn't fit neatly into anything simple. Because sometimes people stayed for reasons that weren't written down on forms. Annie didn't hear all of it, but she felt it. The change in how people looked at her. Not dismissive, not anymore. Curious, respectful, maybe even a little confused. The doors opened. Annie straightened immediately. A nurse stepped out, followed by the same doctor from earlier. He looked more tired now, his movements slower, but his eyes were sharp, focused. He scanned the room, then saw her. He walked over. Annie stood before he reached her. How is he? She asked. Her voice was calm, steady, but there was something else in it now. Something deeper. The doctor stopped in front of her. He made it through the night, he said. The words landed quietly, but they carried weight. Annie blinked once, then nodded. Okay. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. But something inside her shifted just slightly. A small release. He's still not awake, the doctor continued, but his condition has stabilized. That means his body is holding on. Annie looked toward the doors. He's strong, she said. The doctor studied her for a moment, then nodded. Yes, he said. He is. There was a pause. Then Annie asked, Can I see him again? The doctor hesitated only briefly this time. Yes, he said, but just for a few minutes. Annie nodded. Thank you. They walked down the same hallway as before, but it felt different now. Less urgent, less chaotic, still serious, still important, but steadier. When they reached the room, the doctor stepped aside and let her enter first. Annie walked in quietly. The man was still there, still connected to machines. Still pale, but different. His breathing was more even now, not perfect, but stronger. Annie moved to the side of the bed. She didn't rush, didn't speak right away. She just looked. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand again. It was warmer. Noticeably, she nodded to herself. That's better, she whispered. The monitor beeped steadily beside them. Annie leaned slightly closer. You made it, she said softly. I told you to stay. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, his fingers moved. Clearer this time, more deliberate. Annie's eyes widened. Mister, she said quickly. His eyelids fluttered. Once, twice. Then slowly, very slowly, they opened. Not fully, just enough. His gaze was unfocused at first, drifting, searching, trying to make sense of the light, the shapes, the world returning to him piece by piece. Annie didn't move. She stayed right there. I'm here, she said gently. His eyes shifted. Found her. Not completely. Not clearly. But enough. His brow furrowed slightly, confusion flickering across his face. His lips parted, but no sound came out. It's okay, Annie said. You don't have to talk. He blinked slowly. Then again, trying to hold on to consciousness, trying to understand. Annie squeezed his hand just a little. You're in a hospital, she said. You got sick, but you're okay now. The doctor stepped closer, checking the monitors. His expression focused, but calm. Easy, he said to the man. You're safe. Don't try to speak yet. The man's eyes moved again, back to Annie. There was something there now. Not recognition. Not yet. But awareness. A question. Annie tilted her head slightly. You asked for help? She said quietly. So I stayed. The words hung in the air. Simple. Clear. True. The man's gaze held on her just a moment longer. Then his eyes drifted closed again. Not slipping away. Just resting. The doctor exhaled softly. That's a good sign, he said. Very good. Annie nodded. She already knew. She looked down at their hands again. Still connected. Still there. You're not alone anymore, she whispered. And this time, she knew he had heard her. The moment his eyes opened changed something Annie could not fully explain. Not in the room. Not in the machines. Not even in the doctor standing beside her. It changed something inside her. Until that moment, everything had been uncertain. She had acted, moved, decided, without knowing if any of it would matter. She had held on to a stranger with nothing but belief and stubbornness, hoping it would be enough. Now she knew. It had mattered. He was still here. The doctor adjusted something on the monitor, watching the steady rhythm of the man's heartbeat. We'll keep monitoring him closely, he said. Mostly to himself. But Annie heard it anyway. He's not out of danger, but this is a strong response. Annie nodded slightly, though her eyes stayed on the man. He had fallen back asleep, or something close to it. His breathing was calmer now, more even, like his body had finally found a rhythm it could hold on to. She stood there a moment longer. Then she spoke again, quieter this time. "You did good," she said. It sounded like something her mother would say. The doctor glanced at her briefly, then back at his patient. After a moment, he said, "All right, that's enough for now. He needs rest." Annie looked at the man's hand, still under hers. She hesitated. Then slowly she let go, but not all at once. Her fingers lingered for just a second, like she was making sure he would stay, even after she stepped away. Then she pulled back. "Okay," she said softly. She took a step back from the bed. Her eyes stayed on him. "I'll come back," she added. Again, not a question. A promise. The doctor nodded once, then gestured toward the hallway. Annie followed. The waiting room felt different when she returned. Brighter now. Fuller. Daylight had taken over the windows, softening the edges of everything, but also making it clearer. People moved with more purpose now. Conversations were louder. Life had picked up speed, but Annie moved at the same pace. Steady, quiet. She returned to her chair and sat down. Her hands rested in her lap again, but this time they didn't feel as heavy. Across the room, the front desk nurse was speaking on the phone. Yes, we've been trying to reach you. She's here now. Yes, she's safe." Annie's head tilted slightly. A moment later, the nurse looked up and caught her eye. "Annie?" she called gently. Annie stood. "Yes, ma'am." The nurse motioned her over. Annie walked carefully across the room. "That was your mom," the nurse said. "She's on her way." Annie nodded. "Okay." There was a pause. The nurse studied her for a moment, then said, "You gave us quite a night." Annie didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't. She simply said, "He's still here." The nurse's expression softened. "Yes," she said, "he is." Annie returned to her seat. Now there was something new added to the waiting. Not just the man. Her mother. She pictured her clearly. Hair pulled back. Work uniform still on. Moving quickly. Worried. That thought pressed against Annie's chest slightly. Not fear. Not exactly. Just awareness. She hadn't told her. Hadn't warned her. She had simply stayed. The doors opened again. But this time, it wasn't a doctor. It was a woman, moving fast, scanning the room, eyes sharp, searching. "Annie." The voice cut through everything. Annie stood immediately. "Mama." Celeste Johnson crossed the room in seconds. She dropped her bag to the floor and knelt down in front of her daughter. Hands immediately on Annie's shoulders. Then her face. Checking. Searching. "You okay? You hurt?" she asked quickly. "I'm okay," Annie said. Celeste pulled her into a tight embrace. Not rushed. Not half. Full. Complete. Annie leaned into it. For the first time since the station, her body softened. Just a little. "I got a call. They said you were here," Celeste said. Her voice quieter now, but still tight with concern. "What happened?" Annie pulled back slightly. "There was a man," she said. "He fell. He couldn't breathe." Celeste's expression shifted. "And you stayed?" she said. It wasn't a question. Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Celeste closed her eyes for a brief second. Not in frustration, not in anger, in something deeper. Then she opened them again. "You called for help?" "Yes, ma'am." "They came?" Annie hesitated, then said, "I had to help first." Celeste studied her face. Really studied it. Then she exhaled slowly. Her hands moved to Annie's cheeks again. "You did right," she said. "Simple. Certain. No doubt." Annie nodded. "I know." Celeste glanced around the room, then back at Annie. "Where is he?" "In there," Annie said, pointing toward the doors. "He's still here." He woke up for a little bit. Celeste's eyes followed her gesture. Then she looked back at her daughter. "You stayed with him the whole time?" Annie nodded again. "Yes, ma'am." Celeste's grip softened, but didn't let go. "You missed your train," she said quietly. The words hung there. Not heavy, not accusing, just true. Annie looked at her, then said, "He needed help." Celeste held her gaze. Long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Understanding, pride, and something else. Something quieter. "All right," Celeste said finally. She stood slowly, taking Annie's hand. "Then we'll deal with everything else later." Annie squeezed her hand slightly, then looked back toward the doors. "He's not alone anymore," she said. Celeste followed her gaze, then nodded. No, she said, he's not. And for the first time since the night began, Annie wasn't the only one standing watch. The hospital did not slow down for reunions. Even as Annie stood beside her mother, hand in hand, the world around them continued in its steady, unyielding motion. Nurses moved past with charts tucked under their arms. Phones rang at the front desk. A stretcher rolled by, wheels humming softly against the floor. Life and crisis existed side by side here, and neither one waited for the other. Celeste kept her hand wrapped firmly around Annie's, her thumb brushing lightly over her daughter's knuckles, as if confirming she was real, that she was safe, that she was whole. You hungry? She asked after a moment, her voice gentler now. Annie shook her head slightly. I ate crackers. Celeste gave a small nod. All right. She looked toward the doors again, then back at Annie. You said he woke up? Just a little, Annie replied. He looked at me. Celeste studied her face carefully, searching for exaggeration, for confusion, for anything that might not be certain. But Annie's expression didn't waver. He heard me, Annie added quietly. Celeste didn't question that either. Instead, she said, then that matters. They sat down together, side by side now. The chair felt smaller with both of them, but Annie leaned slightly into her mother, just enough to feel the warmth of her presence. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was shared. At the front desk, the nurse who had spoken to Annie earlier approached them. Ma'am, she said gently to Celeste. Celeste looked up. Yes? I'm one of the nurses on duty. Your daughter's been with us since late last night, she said. She did. Something very important. Celeste glanced at Annie, then back at the nurse. She told me, Celeste said. The nurse nodded. The man she brought in, he had a severe cardiac event. If he hadn't gotten help when he did, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Celeste's jaw tightened slightly. She stayed with him, the nurse added. All the way here, all night. Celeste looked at Annie again. There was no surprise in her eyes, only recognition. That sounds like her, she said. The nurse smiled faintly. It does. There was a pause. Then the nurse said, we still don't have identification on him. No wallet, no phone, nothing on record yet. Celeste frowned slightly. No one's come looking for him? Not yet, the nurse said. Annie looked toward the doors again. He has someone, she said quietly. Both adults turned to her. How do you know? The nurse asked. Annie thought about it. Not logically. Not in a way she could explain with facts. He asked for help, she said. People who ask for help, they don't usually want to be alone. The nurse held her gaze for a moment longer than expected, then nodded slowly. That's true, she said. She excused herself after that, returning to the front desk. Celeste leaned back slightly in her chair. You always think like that? She asked Annie. Annie looked up at her. I don't know, she said. Celeste smiled faintly. I do, she said. The doors opened again. The same doctor stepped out, scanning the room before his eyes settled on Annie and then Celeste beside her. He walked toward them. Mrs. Johnson? He asked. Celeste stood. Yes, sir. I'm Dr. Harris, he said, offering a brief nod. I've been overseeing the patient your daughter brought in. Celeste extended her hand automatically. Thank you for taking care of him. Dr. Harris shook it once, firm but brief. Your daughter played a critical role in him being here at all. Celeste glanced at Annie again. I believe that, she said. Dr. Harris looked between them. He regained partial consciousness earlier, he said. That's a strong sign. We're continuing to monitor his heart function. But for now, he's stable. Celeste nodded. That's good. Annie stepped forward slightly. Can we see him again? She asked. Dr. Harris hesitated. Then he said, for a few minutes, yes. But he may not be fully awake. That's okay, Annie said. Dr. Harris gave a small nod. All right. Come with me. Celeste and Annie followed him through the doors together. This time, Annie wasn't alone. The hallway felt different again, not just because of the daylight, but because of the presence beside her. Her mother's hand rested lightly on her shoulder now, steady, reassuring. They entered the room. The man lay where Annie had left him. The machines continued their quiet work. The room felt calmer now, less fragile, but still serious. Annie stepped closer to the bed. Celeste stayed just behind her, observing. "That's him?" she asked softly. Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Celeste studied the man for a moment. Then her expression changed slightly, not recognition, not yet, but something thoughtful. "He don't look like nobody's nobody," she said quietly. Annie didn't fully understand the sentence, but she felt what it meant. The man stirred slightly, a small movement, then another. His eyes opened again, slower this time. He blinked against the light. His gaze moved, unfocused at first, then steadier. Then, he saw them, Annie, and behind her, Celeste. His brow furrowed faintly, confusion still clouding his expression. His lips parted. A dry, strained sound came out. Where? "Easy," Dr. Harris said, stepping closer. "You're in the hospital. You had a cardiac event. You're safe." The man's eyes shifted again, back to Annie. He looked at her longer this time. Something in his gaze changed. Recognition, not of her name, not of her face in detail, but of the moment, the feeling, the presence. Annie stepped closer. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're okay now." His breathing steadied slightly. His eyes remained on her. Then, slowly, his hand moved. Just a little. Toward her. Annie didn't hesitate. She took it, her fingers wrapping around his again, just like before. "I'm still here," she said. His grip tightened. Weak, but real. Celeste watched the exchange quietly. Then she looked at Dr. Harris. "He knows her," she said. Dr. Harris nodded slightly. "On some level," he said. The man's eyes didn't leave Annie, and for the first time, he wasn't just holding on to life. He was holding on to her. The room grew quieter, not because the machines had stopped or the hospital had slowed, but because something unspoken had settled into place. The man's hand remained in Annie's, not tightly, not with strength, but with intention. His fingers curled just enough to hold on. Annie didn't move. She stood beside the bed, her small hand steady in his, her eyes fixed on his face as if she were making sure he didn't disappear again. "You're still here," she said softly. His gaze stayed on her. There was confusion in it, yes. Weakness, too. But beneath that, something else was beginning to surface, recognition not of who she was, but of what she had been in his darkest moment. A presence, a voice, a reason not to let go. His lips moved slightly. The sound that came out was rough, barely there. "You? Dr. Heck, you're dusting, you're dusting, you're dusting, you're dusting, you're dusting, you're dusting the monitor, with one hand while watching the man carefully. "Don't try to speak too much," he said. "Your body's still recovering." But the man didn't look at him. He looked at Annie. His brow tightened slightly, like he was trying to piece together something just out of reach. Annie leaned forward just a little. "It's okay," she said gently. "You don't have to talk." His breathing steadied. Not perfectly, but better. Celeste stood just behind Annie, her arms folded loosely now, watching everything with a quiet intensity. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't stepping in. She was observing, learning, understanding. The man's eyes flickered again, slower this time, but they didn't close. They stayed on Annie. Then, with effort, he shifted his hand slightly in hers, not pulling away, reaching. Annie adjusted instinctively, supporting the movement. "I got you," she said. The words came naturally. Simple, certain. Dr. Harris glanced at Celeste briefly, then back at the patient. "He's responding well," he said quietly. "That connection? It helps." Celeste nodded once. "I can see that." The man's breathing grew a little more even, the rise and fall of his chest less strained than before. The machines beside him reflected its steady lines, consistent rhythm. Annie watched it all. Even if she didn't fully understand what each number meant, she understood enough. He wasn't slipping anymore. He was staying. A nurse entered the room quietly, checking the IV line, making small adjustments with practiced hands. She glanced at Annie, then at Celeste, then back at the man. "He's doing better," she said softly. Annie nodded. "I know." The nurse gave her a small, surprised smile. Then she stepped back out, leaving the room as quietly as she had entered. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had happened, everything that could have gone differently, everything that hadn't. The man blinked again, slower now. His grip on Annie's hand loosened slightly, not from weakness this time, but from rest. His body was beginning to settle, to trust that it didn't have to fight quite as hard anymore. His eyes drifted, just for a second, then returned to her. Annie tilted her head slightly. You should rest, she said. Doctors said you need it. His eyelids lowered a fraction, not fully closed, just enough to show he was listening. She gave a small nod, as if confirming it for him. I'll still be here, she added. That seemed to be enough. His eyes closed slowly, not in collapse, not in fear, in rest, real rest. Dr. Harris exhaled quietly. That's the best thing for him right now, he said. Annie didn't move. She kept holding his hand, just a little longer. Then, carefully, she began to pull away, but before she could fully let go, his fingers tightened again. Weak, but deliberate. Annie paused, looked at him. His eyes were still closed, but his hand had held hers again, like something inside him wasn't ready to lose that connection yet. Annie didn't smile. She didn't laugh. She simply adjusted her grip again. I'm still here, she whispered. Celeste watched closely now. There was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not just pride, not just relief. Something deeper. Respect. For her daughter, for the moment, for what she was witnessing. After a few seconds, the man's grip relaxed again. This time, it stayed that way. Annie slowly, gently, released his hand. She stepped back, her eyes lingering on him for just a moment longer. Then she turned slightly toward her mother. He's going to be okay, she said. Celeste looked at her, then at the man, then back at her. Looks that way, she replied. Dr. Harris nodded. We'll keep monitoring him. But this is a strong turn. Annie absorbed that. A strong turn. That meant something had changed. Something important. They began to move toward the door. But before Annie stepped out, she looked back one more time. The man lay still, breathing, alive, no longer alone. She gave a small nod to herself. Then she followed her mother out. The hallway felt different again. Not lighter, not easier, but clearer, like something had been decided, like something had held. As they walked back toward the waiting room, Celeste placed her hand gently on Annie's shoulder. You stayed, she said quietly. Annie nodded. Yes, ma'am. Celeste's voice softened. That's not something people forget. Annie thought about that, about the man, about the platform, about the voices that had told her to walk away. Then she said, I didn't do it so he would remember. Celeste looked at her, then nodded slowly. I know, she said, and that was exactly why it mattered. By late morning, the hospital no longer felt like a place caught between night and day. It had fully awakened. And with it came a different kind of rhythm. Faster, louder, more structured. Staff moved with purpose. Conversations carried more clarity. Decisions were made quicker, with less hesitation. And yet, inside the monitored room at the end of the hallway, time still moved carefully. Measured, watched, protected. Annie sat beside her mother in the waiting area, but her attention remained anchored somewhere beyond the doors. She wasn't restless. She wasn't impatient. But there was a quiet pull in her posture, like part of her had stayed behind in that room and hadn't quite returned. Celeste noticed. You want to go back in? She asked gently. Annie looked up. Yes, ma'am. Celeste nodded. All right. Let's ask first. They stood and walked toward the nurse's station. The same nurse from earlier glanced up, recognition crossing her face immediately. She can go in again? Celeste asked. The nurse smiled faintly. He's awake more consistently now. Just for a few minutes. Annie didn't wait for more. She moved with quiet urgency, not rushing, but certain. The hallway felt shorter this time, the room closer. When she stepped inside, everything was just slightly different. The man's eyes were already open, not drifting, not flickering. Open, aware. He was looking toward the door, waiting. Annie stopped for just a second, then stepped forward. I'm here, she said. His eyes found her immediately. This time, there was no confusion in the way he looked at her. Still weak, still tired, but clearer, more focused, like something inside him had settled into place. His lips moved again, slower, more controlled than before. You stayed. The words came out rough, but they were there. Real. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. She stepped closer to the bed. He watched her the entire time, like he needed to confirm she wasn't something imagined, something temporary. I told you I would, she added softly. His eyes held hers, then shifted slightly, noticing Celeste behind her. A flicker of awareness crossed his face again. Celeste gave a small nod. Good morning, she said calmly. You gave us a scare. The man's gaze moved between them, trying to understand, trying to piece together what had happened. His brow furrowed slightly. My phone, he murmured faintly. Dr. Harris, who had been standing just outside the doorway, stepped in. You didn't have one with you, he said. No identification either. The man blinked slowly. That didn't seem to make sense to him. It didn't fit. Annie watched him carefully. You were at the train station, she said. You fell. You couldn't breathe. His eyes returned to her again, and something clicked. Not fully, but enough. The platform, he whispered. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. His breathing shifted slightly. Not worse, just deeper, like memory itself carried weight. And you, he said, his voice fading slightly. Annie stepped a little closer. I stayed, she said again. The room went quiet. The machines continued their steady rhythm. The doctor observed without interrupting. Celeste watched without stepping in. The man's gaze softened. Not weak, not fading. Something else. Gratitude, but also something heavier. Recognition of cost. You missed, he began, then stopped, his voice catching. Annie didn't let him struggle. It's okay, she said gently. He looked at her, really looked this time. You're a child, he said slowly, as if the realization itself surprised him. Annie tilted her head slightly. I know. That answer caught him off guard. A faint, almost invisible shift in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Celeste let out a quiet breath through her nose. He knows now, she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. The man's hand moved again. This time, not searching blindly. Reaching. Deliberate. Annie saw it. She placed her hand in his without hesitation. His grip was still weak, but stronger than before. You stayed, he repeated. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. There was a long pause. Then he said something quieter. Something that almost didn't make it out. Why? The question hung there. Not accusing. Not confused. Just honest. Annie didn't take long to answer. Because you asked for help, she said. Simple. Clear. Enough. The man held her gaze. And for a moment, everything else in the room seemed to fall away. The machines, the hospital, the distance between who they were and what they had just shared. Dr. Harris shifted slightly, breaking the silence just enough. We should let him rest again, he said. He's improving, but recovery takes time. The man didn't argue, didn't resist, but his hand tightened just slightly in Annie's. Annie noticed. I'll come back, she said. He studied her face, then gave the smallest nod. It cost him effort, but he did it anyway. Annie slowly let go of his hand. This time, he didn't reach back. Not because he didn't want to, because he trusted. She stepped back toward her mother. Celeste placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. You did enough for now, she said. Annie nodded, but before she turned to leave, she looked back once more. The man was still watching her, not confused, not searching. Certain. He knew now, not everything, but the most important part, that someone had stayed when no one else did, and that truth had already begun to change something in him. As Annie walked out of the room beside her mother, she didn't feel like she had lost anything anymore. She had missed a train, yes, but she had held on to something far more important, and somewhere behind her, a man who had nearly slipped away was still here, because she hadn't let go. By early afternoon, the hospital had settled into a steady rhythm that no longer felt urgent, but no less important. The chaos of the night had passed, replaced by something quieter, more controlled, like a storm that had moved on but left everything changed behind it. Annie sat beside her mother again, her posture still straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. But something about her had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way most people would notice. Inside, she wasn't waiting the same way anymore. Before, she had been holding on to uncertainty. Now, she was holding on to something real. Across the room, the same nurse who had spoken to them earlier approached again, this time with a different expression, more focused, more alert. Mrs. Johnson, she said, addressing Celeste. Celeste stood. Yes, ma'am? We may have identified the patient, the nurse said. Annie's head lifted immediately. Celeste's expression sharpened. You have? The nurse nodded. Someone called in about a missing individual this morning. The description matched. We asked a few questions, confirmed a few details. She paused briefly, as if choosing her next words carefully. He's not just anyone. Celeste didn't react right away, but Annie felt the shift in her mother's hand. Who is he? Celeste asked. The nurse glanced at Annie for a brief moment, then back at Celeste. His name is Daniel Whitaker, she said. He's a CEO. Runs a major investment firm, one of the largest in the state. The words settled into the air slowly. Annie blinked. She didn't fully understand what that meant, but she understood the tone. Important. Different. Celeste's expression changed not with excitement, not with surprise exactly, but with recognition of what that kind of name carried in the world. Does he have family? Celeste asked. Yes, the nurse said, and they're on their way. Annie looked toward the doors again. Family. That meant he wouldn't be alone anymore. That was good, but something else stirred quietly in her chest. Something she didn't have a word for yet. The nurse continued. His assistant is already trying to get here. We've been in contact. Celeste nodded slowly. All right, she said. The nurse gave a small, respectful glance toward Annie. He's lucky, she added. Very lucky. Then she walked away. Silence settled between Annie and her mother. Not heavy, just thoughtful. Celeste looked down at Annie. You hear that? She said gently. Annie nodded. Yes, ma'am. That man you helped. He's got people, Celeste said. Annie looked at her. I know. Celeste studied her face. You still would have stayed? She asked. Annie didn't hesitate. Yes, ma'am. Celeste nodded. I know you would have. There was no doubt in her voice. None at all. Time passed again, but differently now. There was movement building beneath the surface of the hospital. Phones ringing more frequently at the front desk. Staff speaking in slightly quicker tones. Something was coming. Annie noticed it. She always noticed things like that. Then, the doors at the far end of the waiting area opened sharply. Not slowly, not cautiously. Quickly, a man in a dark suit stepped inside, followed by another, both moving with purpose, scanning the room immediately. They didn't look like visitors. They looked like men used to being where they needed to be when they needed to be there. Excuse me, one of them said, approaching the front desk. We're here for Daniel Whitaker. The nurse nodded, already expecting them. Right this way, she said. Annie watched. Her eyes followed them as they moved quickly toward the hallway, toward the doors, toward him. She didn't move, but something inside her shifted again. This time, it wasn't about fear or uncertainty. It was about change. The man she had found alone on the platform was not alone anymore. The doors opened. The men disappeared inside, and for the first time since the night began, Annie wasn't the one holding everything together. She looked down at her hands, then back up. He has people now, she said quietly. Celeste nodded. Yes, he does. Annie leaned back slightly in her chair. Her body relaxed in a way it hadn't before. Not fully, but enough. The responsibility she had been carrying, it was shifting. Not gone, but shared. Minutes later, Dr. Harris stepped out again, speaking with the suited men in low, serious tones. Annie couldn't hear the words, but she saw the expressions. Concern, relief, urgency, gratitude, all mixed together. One of the men glanced toward the waiting area briefly. His eyes landed on Annie, held there for a second, then looked away. But that second mattered, because something had been understood. Something had been connected. Dr. Harris turned and walked toward Annie and Celeste. They're his team, he explained. They've been looking for him since last night. Celeste nodded. Family coming too? Yes, Dr. Harris said. They've been notified. Annie looked at him. Can I still see him? She asked. Dr. Harris paused, then nodded. Yes, he said. But things may be different now. Annie didn't fully understand what he meant, but she nodded anyway. Okay, because whatever changed, one thing didn't. She had been there first, and that mattered in a way no title ever could. As the hospital continued to move around her, Annie Johnson sat quietly in her chair, watching the world catch up to a moment she had already lived through, the moment where a stranger asked for help, and she had answered. The hallway outside Daniel Whitaker's room no longer belonged to the quiet rhythm of recovery. It belonged to something else now. Voices controlled but urgent moved in low waves just beyond the door. Shoes echoed more sharply against the polished floor. The air itself seemed tighter, as if the space had been filled with expectation. Inside the room, however, it was still the same. Monitors blinked, machines hummed, and Daniel Whitaker lay in the hospital bed, breathing steadily, his strength returning one careful moment at a time. Annie stood near the doorway, just inside, her small frame still, her eyes focused. She had been allowed back in, even after the men in suits. even after everything had changed, because something had been understood by the doctors, by the nurses, even by the people who had just arrived with authority and urgency. She belonged here, not by status, not by name, but by what she had done. Daniel's eyes were open again, clearer now, stronger. When he saw her, there was no confusion this time, only recognition. "You came back," he said, his voice still rough but steadier than before. Annie nodded. "Yes, sir." She stepped closer to the bed. Behind her, 2 men in suits stood near the wall, watching quietly. One of them older, composed, carrying the weight of responsibility, and the way he held himself kept his eyes moving between Daniel and Annie, trying to understand something that didn't fit into the world he knew. Daniel shifted slightly, wincing just enough to show the effort it cost him. "You stayed all night," he said. Annie didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. He already knew. "Yes, sir," she said finally. There was a pause. Then Daniel's gaze softened in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. "You missed something important," he said. It wasn't a guess. It was a realization. Annie looked at him, then said simply, "Yes, sir." The room grew quieter. Even the men in suits didn't move. Daniel studied her. Not quickly. Not casually. Carefully, like he was trying to measure something that couldn't be counted in numbers. "What was it?" he asked. Annie hesitated for just a second, then answered, "A school interview." Daniel's expression changed, subtly, but unmistakably. "For a scholarship," she added. The words settled heavily into the space between them. One of the men in suits shifted his weight slightly. The other lowered his gaze, because now they understood, not just what had happened, but what it had cost. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not from pain, from something deeper. When he opened them again, they didn't go anywhere else. They stayed on her. "You gave that up," he said quietly. Annie shook her head. "I didn't give it up," she said. He waited. She continued, "I chose to stay." The difference was small, but it changed everything. Daniel let out a slow breath, one that seemed to carry more weight than the others. Behind Annie, Celeste stood silently, her presence steady, her eyes never leaving the man in the bed. She wasn't impressed. She wasn't intimidated. She was watching, measuring him the same way he was measuring her daughter. The moment stretched, then something shifted. Daniel moved his hand again, this time stronger, more certain. He reached toward Annie. She stepped forward without hesitation and placed her hand in his. The connection felt different now, not fragile, not uncertain, real. "You didn't know who I was," he said. Annie tilted her head slightly. "No, sir." "And you stayed anyway?" "Yes, sir." Another pause. Then Daniel said something slower, more deliberate. "That's not how the world usually works." Annie thought about that, then said, "Maybe it should." The words landed in the room with quiet force. No one spoke. Not the doctor, not the men in suits, not even Celeste. Because there was nothing to correct, nothing to argue, only something to absorb. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then, something unexpected happened. He shifted forward slightly. The movement was small, but intentional. And then, he lowered his head. Not fully, not dramatically, but enough. Enough that his eyes were no longer looking down at her. They were level, A to A, the same way she had knelt beside him on the platform, the same way she had refused to stand above him when he was at his weakest. The room went completely still. The man in the bed, the men in suits, the doctor, Celeste. Everyone saw it, and everyone understood it. Daniel Whitaker, a man used to being above others in every measurable way, had lowered himself to meet a 6-year-old girl exactly where she stood. "I owe you my life," he said. The words were not loud, but they carried. Annie didn't react the way most people would expect. She didn't smile, didn't step back, didn't look overwhelmed. She simply said, "You needed help." Daniel exhaled, a faint, almost disbelieving breath. "Yes," he said, "I did." Another pause. Then, more quietly, "And you were the only one who stayed." Annie didn't answer that, because she didn't need to. He already knew it was true. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something rare, respect, real, unfiltered, not based on power, not based on wealth, but on a moment where one human being chose not to walk away from another. Finally, Dr. Harris stepped forward slightly. "We should let him rest," he said gently. Daniel nodded once, but his hand didn't let go immediately. Annie waited, then said softly, "I'll come back." Daniel looked at her. This time, there was no uncertainty in his expression, only certainty. "I know," he said. Annie slowly released his hand, stepped back, and turned toward her mother. Celeste placed her hand on Annie's shoulder again. Firm, proud. As they walked toward the door, the men in suits stepped aside without being asked, making space, not because they had to, because they understood. Annie passed between them quietly, small, unassuming, but carrying something none of them could replicate. The door closed behind her, and inside the room, Daniel Whitaker lay back against the pillow, alive, because one person had decided that his life was worth more than her opportunity. And for the first time in a long time, he understood what that really meant. The hospital doors opened, and for the first time since the night began, Annie stepped outside. The air felt different, cooler, vida, like the world had been waiting for her to come back to it. Celeste held her hand as they walked down the concrete steps together. The city stretching out in front of them, cars moving, people passing, life continuing as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But Annie knew it had, even if no one else could see it, even if the ground beneath her feet looked the same. She had walked into the night with a train ticket and a future carefully planned in small, fragile pieces. She walked out without that ticket, but with something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. They stopped near the curb. Celeste looked down at her. "You tired?" she asked. Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Celeste gave a small smile. "Me too." They stood there for a moment, not rushing to leave, not rushing to speak. The morning traffic moved past them in steady waves, the sound of engines and distant horns filling the quiet between them. Then Annie asked, "Are you mad?" Celeste looked at her. "Mad? That I missed it," Annie said. "The interview." Celeste held her gaze for a long second, then she shook her head. "No," she said. Annie searched her face. "You're not?" Celeste crouched down slowly until they were eye level. "No, baby," she said gently. "I'm not mad." There was no hesitation in her voice, no hidden disappointment, just truth. Annie let out a small breath. "But it was important," she said. Celeste nodded. "It was." Another pause. Then Annie asked, "What if I don't get another chance?" Celeste studied her carefully. Then she said something slower, something deeper. "Then we make one." The words settled into Annie's chest. Not loud, not dramatic, but strong. She nodded. "Okay." Celeste stood back up, taking Annie's hand again. "Come on," she said. "Let's get you home." They began walking down the sidewalk. The city unfolding around them in familiar ways, corner stores opening, buses stopping, people carrying coffee cups and conversations. Ordinary life. But Annie didn't feel quite the same inside it. Not smaller, not lost. Just different. As they reached the edge of the street, Annie glanced back once. The hospital stood tall behind them. Glass and concrete. Buzu. Unchanged. But she knew something inside it had changed. Because she had been there. Because she had stayed. They crossed the street together, and for a while, nothing else happened. No dramatic moment. No sudden shift. Just walking. Just moving forward. Until a black car pulled up beside them. Smooth. Quiet. Out of place on that street. It stopped just ahead, then reversed slightly, aligning with them. The rear door opened. One of the men from the hospital stepped out. The same man in the dark suit. He approached carefully, not rushing, not assuming. "Miss Johnson," he said. Celeste stepped slightly in front of Annie. "Yes?" she replied. The man nodded respectfully. "My name is Mr. Carter," he said. "I work for Mr. Whitaker." Celeste's posture didn't change. She simply waited. Mr. Carter glanced briefly at Annie. "Mr. Whitaker asked me to find you before you left," he continued. "He would like to speak with you again." Celeste's eyes narrowed slightly, not suspicious, but protective. "He already spoke to her," she said. Mr. Carter nodded. "Yes, ma'am. But this time, it's different." There was something in his tone. Not authority, not pressure, something closer to respect. Annie looked up at her mother. Celeste looked down at her. A silent exchange passed between them. Then Celeste turned back. "For how long?" she asked. "Not long," Mr. Carter said. "Just a few minutes." Celeste considered it, then nodded once. "All right." Mr. Carter stepped aside, opening the car door. "Please." Celeste didn't move immediately. Instead, she looked at Annie. "You okay?" she asked. Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Celeste gave a small nod in return. Then they stepped forward together. They didn't rush, didn't hesitate. They simply walked. The car interior was quiet, clean, almost too still compared to the world outside. Annie sat beside her mother, her hands resting in her lap again, her posture unchanged. The door closed. The car moved, back toward the hospital, but not to the emergency entrance, to a different side. Acquiescer one. They were led inside again, this time through a hallway Annie hadn't seen before. Fewer people, softer lights, more controlled. Mr. Carter stopped at a door and opened it. "Right in here," he said. Annie stepped inside. Daniel Whitaker was sitting up, not fully, but enough. No longer just a patient lying still, a man recovering, a man aware. He looked at her the moment she entered, and this time, there was no distance left in his eyes, only certainty. "You came back," he said. Annie nodded. "Yes, sir." Celeste stood just behind her. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly to her, then back to Annie. "I needed to say this properly," he said. His voice was still rough, but stronger, more deliberate. Annie waited. Daniel took a slow breath, then said, "You changed something that night." Annie tilted her head slightly. "I just stayed," she said. Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said, "and that's exactly what changed everything." He paused, then added, "People like me, we're used to things working a certain way." He glanced down briefly, then back at her. But that night, none of it worked. The room was quiet. "Except you," he said. Annie didn't respond. She just listened. Daniel continued, "You didn't know who I was. You didn't have anything to gain. And you still chose to stay." He leaned forward slightly, "And because of that, I'm still here." Annie looked at him, then said simply, "You needed help." Daniel exhaled softly. "Yes," he said, "I did." Another pause. Then, he said something that carried weight beyond the room. "I'm going to make sure you don't lose anything because of what you did." Annie frowned slightly. "I didn't lose anything," she said. Daniel studied her, then nodded slowly. "That's exactly why you deserve everything." Celeste watched closely now, not interrupting, but present. Daniel continued, "Your interview, your opportunity, that's not gone." Annie blinked. "It isn't?" "No," he said, "because I won't let it be." The words were calm, certain, not a promise, a decision. Annie looked at her mother. Celeste looked back at her, then nodded once. Daniel leaned back slightly, his strength still limited, but his voice steady. "You gave me something that can't be measured," he said. "Now it's my turn." The room fell quiet again, but this time, it wasn't filled with uncertainty. It was filled with something else. A shift, a turning point, not just for Annie, but for everyone in that room. Because sometimes, the world doesn't change because of power. It changes because someone small refuses to walk away. And that is where everything begins. This story reminds us that true kindness is not measured by what we gain, but by what we are willing to give when no one is watching. In a world that often teaches us to protect our own opportunities, Annie chose compassion over convenience and humanity over fear. Her decision shows that real character is revealed in moments of sacrifice, when doing the right thing comes at a personal cost. And sometimes, the quiet choices we make for others without expecting anything in return have the power to change not just one life, but many. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.